Hey, ready to look at the most stupid deaths ever recorded? From a road crew worker lingering near freshly refueled machinery as gasoline fumes quietly filled the evening air, to an urban explorer who climbed into a drained water tank just to get a better photograph. It was August 14, 2016, at a toll plaza connected to a busy interstate near Newark, New Jersey. Traffic remained steady throughout the evening as vehicles passed through the toll lanes and continued onto the highway. The area was well lit, and security cameras monitored the booths and surrounding roadway. The person at the center of this story was Romina Mims, a 38-year-old unemployed laborer. People who knew her described her as impulsive. She often focused on whatever goal was directly in front of her without spending much time thinking about what would happen afterward. Romina had been out of steady work for some time and was struggling to keep up with everyday expenses. Bills continued piling up while her savings disappeared. People close to her later described growing financial stress in the weeks leading up to the incident. Instead of finding a long-term solution, Romina became focused on finding a fast way to get cash. I think most people can relate to worrying about money. The pressure Romina was dealing with was real, but the solution she chose only made things worse. She spent several evenings watching the toll plaza because she believed the booths contained enough cash to make the risk worthwhile. After studying traffic patterns and employee routines, she convinced herself she could commit the robbery and escape before anyone stopped her. To avoid connecting her vehicle to the crime, Romina parked on the opposite side of the interstate. The decision created a longer and far more dangerous route back to her car, but she believed it would help her avoid identification. Romina chose speed over planning. After dark, she approached the plaza on foot. Security cameras later showed her entering one of the occupied booths and producing a handgun. She pointed it at the operator and demanded cash from the register. Fearing for their safety, the employee complied. As soon as Romina left, the operator alerted authorities. Romina exited carrying the stolen cash and immediately headed toward the interstate. Her vehicle was parked on the opposite side, and she appeared determined to reach it as quickly as possible. Instead of using the access road, she ran directly into active traffic. Drivers traveling along the interstate suddenly saw a person running between vehicles. Several sounded their horns, while others braked as Romina crossed lane after lane through traffic. Witnesses later reported that she came dangerously close to being hit more than once. One driver braked hard and missed her by only a few feet. Rather than retreat, she continued moving toward the opposite side of the highway. Motorists began calling emergency services after realizing someone was running through highway traffic. Despite the near misses, Romina kept going. Witnesses reported that she continued clutching the stolen cash as she moved between vehicles. She crossed additional lanes and continued toward her vehicle. A second vehicle narrowly avoided striking her. For a brief moment, it appeared she might actually make it across. Seconds later, a different vehicle struck Romina at highway speed. The impact threw her across the roadway. Traffic immediately slowed and stopped around the collision scene as drivers called for help. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but Romina had suffered catastrophic blunt force injuries. She was pronounced dead at the scene. If there is one thing this story reminds me, it is that the quickest way out of a problem is not always the way that gets you home safely. Investigators later recovered portions of the stolen cash scattered across multiple lanes of the roadway, along with the handgun used during the robbery. Surveillance footage and witness statements confirmed that Romina voluntarily entered active highway traffic while trying to reach the vehicle she had parked across the interstate. The toll booth operator was uninjured. Authorities found no vehicle, roadway, or driver-related factors that contributed to the collision. Because the driver had been traveling lawfully and had no reasonable opportunity to avoid impact, no charges were filed. The case was closed as a fatal robbery-related incident. Romina died from blunt force injuries sustained after being struck by a vehicle during her escape attempt. It was June 25, 2018, in Yosemite National Park, California. Summer crowds filled the trails as visitors moved between overlooks and picnic areas. Beyond the marked paths, steep slopes of loose rock covered the mountainside. Among those tourists was 36-year-old Brecken Cole. Now, Brecken worked as a software engineer out in Phoenix, Arizona. So, personally, I picture him as a guy who spent most of his week glued to a desk. He loved weekend hikes and outdoor trips, but most of his experience came from well-maintained desert trails, not rugged mountain terrain. His friends always described him as smart, dependable, and fiercely competitive. On this specific trip, Brecken and his wife were celebrating 10 years of marriage. A 10th anniversary is a massive milestone, and they had spent months planning this dream vacation. His wife used to tease him about his stubborn streak playfully. See, if something irritated Brecken, he had this habit of turning it into a personal challenge that he had to solve right then and there, even if it didn't matter at all. And I'll be honest, I think a lot of us can relate to having that kind of stubborn pride. As morning turned into noon, the couple stopped beside the trail for a quick snack break. Brecken set an open bag of trail mix down on a flat rock while he snapped some pictures of the scenery. Now, Yosemite rangers warn you constantly not to leave food unattended because the squirrels there will straight up rob you. But personally, I think a lot of tourists completely underestimate just how bold and fearless these little animals actually are. Within seconds, a squirrel rushed over and started pulling food right out of the bag. A few nearby hikers laughed as the animal darted away with its prize. But for Brecken, the laughter made him feel exposed. He immediately chased after it. Other visitors told him it was no big deal and not worth worrying about, and his wife begged him to just leave it alone and get back on the trail. Instead, embarrassed by the attention and totally annoyed that a rodent had just punked him, Brecken followed the squirrel farther and farther away from the marked path. The animal disappeared among the rocks near a steep, unstable slope of loose stone. The ground got incredibly sketchy. Small stones shifted right beneath his shoes, and larger rocks wobbled under his weight, which would have terrified me. But he kept pushing toward the spot where he last saw the squirrel. Several yards onto the slope, Brecken stepped onto a bad section of loose rock. Witnesses later told investigators that they saw his right leg suddenly sink deep into the shifting stones. He tried to pull himself free and regain his balance, but that one movement triggered a terrifying chain reaction. The rocks began to slide, and his body twisted sideways as the slope beneath him completely collapsed. Brecken fell hard. Hikers watched in absolute horror as he tumbled down the steep slope, repeatedly striking exposed boulders. His head hit a massive rock first, followed by his chest and shoulder, with a wave of loose stones chasing him downhill. By the time he finally stopped, he had fallen dozens of feet and was lying completely motionless among the scattered rocks below. Emergency services were called immediately. Rangers and rescue crews arrived within minutes, but Brecken's injuries were catastrophic, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner determined that multiple blunt force injuries from the fall, including severe head and chest trauma, were not survivable. The death was ruled accidental. Park officials later used the case in safety briefings to remind visitors to stay on marked trails and avoid chasing wildlife. A brief moment of frustration led to a fatal decision on terrain he did not understand. It was October 12, 2019, in Phoenix, Arizona. The weather was warm, and a busy shopping center was filled with people going from store to store. It looked like a normal weekend until one woman made a decision based on something she had read online instead of common sense. I always wonder how someone convinces themselves that an idea this unbelievable is actually going to work. Gwyneth Park was 34 years old and had previously worked as a delivery driver. She was impulsive, preferred shortcuts over hard work, and often believed she could outsmart situations that stopped other people. After spending hours reading internet posts, she convinced herself that covering her skin with orange juice would somehow prevent security cameras from identifying her. The posts had nothing to do with surveillance, but Gwyneth misunderstood them completely. Instead of questioning what she had read, she planned an entire robbery around that false belief. She bought a toy water pistol that closely resembled a real handgun, wrote a robbery demand on a piece of paper, and covered her face, hands, and neck with orange juice before leaving home. She chose one of the busiest shopping days because she believed the crowd would make her even harder to identify. In her mind, she wasn't gambling with the odds. She genuinely believed she had discovered a trick that everyone else had missed. Rather than spending a few minutes checking whether the claim was real, she trusted strangers on the internet more than basic logic. She never searched for a second opinion or looked for any evidence that the claim had actually worked for anyone. Instead, she kept reading posts that agreed with what she already wanted to believe, making her even more confident that the robbery would be quick and easy. That choice became the foundation for everything that followed. I think a lot of us have believed something we read online before checking if it was true. The difference is that most mistakes end with embarrassment, not an arrest. She walked into a jewelry store and passed directly beneath several security cameras without trying to hide her face. She handed an employee the robbery note while holding the toy pistol in plain view. The employee quietly activated a silent alarm while staying calm. Mall security followed Gwyneth through the live camera system and directed responding officers to her location. She was arrested only minutes later without resistance. Investigators later recovered the robbery note, the toy pistol, and surveillance footage, showing that she never attempted to conceal her identity beyond the orange juice she believed would protect her. The recordings also showed her moving through the mall calmly, suggesting she never realized her plan had already failed. After reviewing the footage, officers were able to account for nearly every step she had taken from the moment she entered the shopping center until her arrest. The following day, Gwyneth was taken to the courthouse for her initial appearance before a judge. While deputies were escorting her through a courthouse stairwell, she suddenly attempted to run toward a nearby public exit. Instead of taking the stairs one step at a time, she tried to clear several steps at once to move faster. Her shoe clipped the edge of a concrete step, causing her to lose her balance. She pitched forward, struck the staircase, and tumbled down several more steps before coming to rest on the landing below. This is the part that really gets me. She had already been caught, but she still believed another shortcut could erase the last one. Courthouse employees immediately called emergency services, while deputies began first aid. Paramedics transported Gwyneth to a nearby hospital, but she later died from injuries suffered in the fall. The medical examiner ruled that Gwyneth died from blunt force injuries sustained during the staircase fall. Surveillance footage from both the shopping center and the courthouse documented the robbery and the failed escape attempt. Investigators concluded that the fatal incident resulted entirely from her own actions. I keep thinking about how none of this came down to bad luck. Every decision she made was supposed to save her time, but each one only pushed her closer to a tragedy that never needed to happen. It was October 23, 2018. A commercial construction project was underway in Henderson, Nevada, where crews were building several new retail structures. Evening was approaching as the workday came to an end. Reed Mullen, 37, had spent the day doing what he'd done for years, moving materials, helping with deliveries, and keeping different parts of the site organized. He wasn't a supervisor or a specialist. Every crew depended on him because he could jump into almost any task that needed attention. That day had been unusually busy. Several deliveries arrived throughout the afternoon, forcing workers to rearrange storage areas to make room. Forklifts moved materials back and forth across the site, and by the end of the shift, the storage yard near the rear of the project looked much different than it had that morning. As the workday ended, crews began packing up and equipment shut down one piece at a time. Trucks started leaving the parking area. If you've ever been on a construction site after quitting time, you know how quickly the place can go from loud and chaotic to almost silent. Reed headed toward his vehicle with everyone else, before remembering he had left a tool pouch near one of the storage rows earlier that afternoon. Rather than leave it overnight, he decided to go back and retrieve it. By then, most workers had already left. The storage yard sat behind the main work area, where bundles of reinforcing steel and other materials had been stacked throughout the day. When Reed arrived, he noticed the layout had changed after several deliveries. His tool pouch was farther inside the storage area than he expected, so he walked down a narrow access lane between two storage rows. Only a few workers remained finishing up before heading home. Near the end of the access lane, Reed spotted the tool pouch he had come back for. As he made his way toward it, a subtle movement occurred within one of the nearby storage stacks. At first, it was so slight that it would have been easy to miss. One of the timber supports beneath a large rebar bundle had gradually settled into the uneven ground throughout the day. As it sank lower, the bundle began shifting slightly. Several steel bars moved just enough to transfer more weight onto the bars beside them. A faint scraping sound echoed from the storage yard, followed by a brief metallic grind. The other workers heard it, but assumed it was just part of the usual activity on site. And that's one of the difficult realities of busy workplaces. With so much routine activity happening around them, the early signs of an emergency can easily blend into the background. Inside the storage lane, the movement continued. The bundle shifted again, and several bars rolled slightly out of alignment before the stack suddenly gave way. A loud metallic impact echoed across the yard, drawing the attention of several workers. They turned toward the sound, but with stacks of materials blocking their view and equipment, equipment still operating elsewhere on the site, it didn't immediately seem unusual. As the project continued shutting down for the evening, no one realized an emergency had occurred until 20 minutes later, someone noticed Reed's vehicle was still parked in the lot. That's when one worker mentioned seeing Reed walk back toward the storage yard earlier, and a few employees headed over to check on him. By then, daylight was fading fast. When workers reached the storage area, they found Reed trapped within the access lane and showing no signs of movement. A cell phone call for emergency assistance was made immediately. Responders arrived within minutes, but the area first had to be stabilized before they could safely reach Reed. The storage yard was temporarily secured while emergency personnel and investigators documented the collapsed bundle and surrounding material stacks. Investigators later determined that a rebar bundle collapsed after a support beneath it shifted on uneven ground, falling into the access lane where Reed was walking. His death was ruled accidental. Investigators determined that he died from injuries sustained when the rebar fell. They cited uneven ground, inadequate support beneath the bundle, and the way materials had been stored in the yard as contributing factors. The affected storage area remained closed until materials could be restacked and site safety procedures reviewed. It was October 15, 2019, at a pumpkin festival in Morton, Illinois. Families spent the day walking between food stands, games, and fall displays. The biggest attraction was a huge decorative pumpkin where people lined up for family pictures. Steel barriers surrounded the display, and warning signs clearly told visitors not to climb or go inside. Ignatius Goodbreak, a 29-year-old freelance social media content creator, enjoyed creating ideas that looked different from everyone else's. While most visitors were taking ordinary pictures, he wanted a video that looked impossible. He believed a clip showing him crawling out of the giant pumpkin would attract far more attention than another festival photo. I can understand wanting to create something memorable, but I think the moment someone ignores warning signs, the risk becomes much bigger than they realize. The pumpkin looked solid from the outside, but inside, it contained a simple steel support frame with narrow maintenance walkways used by workers servicing the decorative lighting. Earlier that afternoon, electricians had opened a maintenance hatch while replacing lighting components. Part of the interior framework had already been loosened during the work, and one temporary walkway section had been secured with retaining clips until repairs could be finished. The display was never meant to support anyone except authorized workers following the maintenance route. As Ignatius walked behind the display, he noticed the unsecured hatch. Carrying only a selfie stick with his phone attached, he climbed through the opening and stepped onto one of the narrow walkways. Inside, there was only enough room for workers to move between the steel supports. Ignatius pointed the camera at himself and slowly backed up so the video would look as though he had just climbed out of the pumpkin. His right foot landed on the temporary platform. It rocked beneath him. He shifted his weight, but the retaining clips pulled loose. The platform swung downward, sending Ignatius about 8 feet into the steel framework below. His back and left shoulder slammed into a heavy crossbeam before he landed on the lower supports. The display had already been partially dismantled for maintenance, leaving sections of its interior frame temporarily unsupported. When the platform tore free, it destabilized the weakened structure. Several large fiberglass panels shifted inward, and part of the display collapsed around him, trapping his legs while broken framework pinned his chest against a steel crossbeam. Visitors heard loud cracking sounds before one side of the display sagged inward. Festival workers immediately cleared the area and called for emergency help. Firefighters first stabilized the damaged structure before cutting through steel and fiberglass. Paramedics reached Ignatius, but there was no safe way to remove him immediately. He had suffered broken ribs, collapsed lungs, a broken pelvis, severe crushing injuries to his chest, and heavy internal bleeding. Watching stories like this always makes me think about how many deadly accidents begin with someone believing a stunt will only take a few seconds. His heart stopped before rescuers could completely free him, and he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The medical examiner ruled that he died from crushing blunt force injuries with massive internal bleeding caused by the partial collapse of the display. Investigators found no negligence, but recommended keeping maintenance hatches locked whenever crews stepped away. Future displays were fitted with locks that could not be opened from the public side. To me, the saddest part is that Ignatius came hoping to create his most successful video, but the only recording left behind became evidence explaining how one unnecessary decision ended his life. It was May 6, 2016, in Tampa, Florida. The morning was already warm, around 80 degrees, with heavy humidity and afternoon storms in the forecast. It was perfect weather for pressure washing, so cleaning crews had started work long before most people were awake. One of them was Elena Rosa Vargas. She was 41 years old, and just 8 months earlier, she'd walked away from a stable office job she'd held for 14 years. Friends thought she was out of her mind. She emptied most of her savings, bought a commercial pressure washer, wrapped her pickup with a company logo, and bet everything on a business she'd never run before. Then, something unexpected happened. A customer posted a before and after video of Elena stripping years of black algae off a neglected driveway. The clip spread across local social media, and within days, she had more calls than she could possibly handle. For the first time in years, she wasn't worrying about whether she'd have enough work. She was worrying about how to keep up with it. Elena took enormous pride in being reliable. She answered every message, showed up early whenever she could, and hated canceling jobs. After risking her savings to build the business, she refused to give anyone a reason to think she'd made a mistake leaving her old career. That Saturday, she had 3 jobs scheduled back-to-back before the afternoon storms arrived. While checking her equipment, she found her rotary turbo nozzle clogged with grit. Replacing it would take days, forcing her to cancel appointments, refund deposits, and risk losing the new customers she'd worked so hard to earn. She'd used the machine almost every day for months without any major problems, so she brushed the clog off as minor. A client later told investigators Elena had texted that morning, saying she'd clear it in a few seconds before heading over. So, she left the pressure washer running to keep the water moving. She held the wand tip against the driveway with one hand and tried to poke a sewing needle into the nozzle with the other. Personally, even thinking about doing that makes me nervous, but the blockage wouldn't budge. She pressed the needle in a little farther and gave the nozzle a slight turn, hoping to loosen whatever was stuck inside. She didn't realize the clog was the only thing keeping thousands of pounds of water pressure trapped behind it. The blockage suddenly broke free. Before Elena could pull her hand away, the fully pressurized stream blasted sideways through the loosened opening at the front of the nozzle instead of out in a controlled spray. The nozzle was still attached to the wand, and for that split second, the machine was operating at full pressure. The concentrated jet struck her leg from only a few inches away. She never had a chance to react. It hit the inside of her upper thigh, and this is where it gets really hard to wrap my head around. When you looked at it, it just looked like a tiny puncture, maybe the size of a pencil tip. But underneath, that water had jammed grit and tissue deep into her muscle, tearing it all up and rupturing a branch of the femoral artery. I can only imagine how confusing that must have been for her. Elena dropped the wand and grabbed her leg, pretty sure it was just a regular cut. It's terrifying how deceptive that looks, and it makes me realize how dangerous those machines really are. Within a minute, her jeans were soaked. She tried to make it toward the house to grab her phone, but she'd already lost too much blood. Her legs just gave out, and she collapsed on the very driveway she'd just finished cleaning. A neighbor later told investigators they had heard the pressure washer running continuously for several minutes, far longer than usual. Thinking something was wrong, they walked over and found Elena lying motionless beside the driveway, her hands still pressed against her injured leg. They immediately called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes and rushed her to the hospital. But unfortunately, despite their efforts to stop the bleeding, she died shortly after arriving. The medical examiner confirmed she died from massive internal blood loss caused by the high-pressure injection. The tiny puncture wound concealed catastrophic internal damage. Investigators ruled the death an accident after determining she had cleared the clog while the pressure washer was still fully pressurized. It's just devastating. You work so hard to build a life, and then a split-second mechanical failure ends it all. Her family ended up canceling the rest of her jobs. Now, local safety instructors use her story to teach people that you have to shut off and depressurize your gear before you even think about clearing a clog. Even a tiny, contained-looking burst can be fatal. It's a brutal lesson, but it's one that really sticks with you. It was September 18th, 2022, in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. Visitors, lined the roads watching wildlife in the open meadows, while rangers reminded them to keep a safe distance from the animals. Right in the middle of all those tourists was 40-year-old Caspian Moores. Caspian worked in real estate down in Colorado and had recently gotten really into travel photography. He wasn't some famous influencer, but he loved sharing his trips on social media. But over time, and I think a lot of us are guilty of this, he became hyper-focused on capturing that one image, the kind of shot that would stand out from the thousands of identical vacation photos people scroll past every single day. For his milestone 40th birthday, Caspian and his wife Melissa finally took that big Yellowstone trip they've been talking about for years. His friends always described him as outgoing, super competitive, and incredibly determined. To be honest, he was the type of guy who always pushed himself just a little bit further than he probably should have. This vacation was supposed to celebrate a big moment in his life. And me, personally, I get why he wanted something special. He wanted photos that felt grand enough to remember forever. On the third afternoon of their trip, traffic slowed to a crawl along a park road after visitors spotted a grizzly bear feeding out in a meadow several hundred feet away. Dozens of people gathered along the dirt shoulder to watch, most staying right by their vehicles while snapping pictures. Caspian joined right in and spent several minutes photographing the bear. But when he stopped to review the images on his phone, the bear just looked tiny and distant. And according to Melissa, Caspian wanted something way more dramatic. Personally, I think he was chasing that algorithm high. He wanted a photo that looked so close, it would make people instantly stop scrolling. Just then, a nearby ranger reminded the crowd to maintain the required distance from the bears, warning everyone that these animals can react unpredictably if they feel crowded. Caspian actually stepped back at first when the ranger walked by, but as soon as the ranger moved farther down the viewing area, he started walking right out into the meadow. Several tourists noticed and literally yelled at him to stop. One photographer even pointed out that people get mauled every single year because they get too close to the wildlife. But for some reason, Caspian just ignored them. The bear stayed focused on eating, and I think each successful step Caspian took just convinced him that the next one would be safe too. When Caspian finally stopped, he had moved far beyond the main viewing area and well inside the recommended safety zone. And then the bear suddenly lifted its head and looked directly at him. Melissa screamed for him to come back. Instead, Caspian raised his phone and started recording a video. The bear stood upright for just a second, then dropped to all fours and charged. Witness footage actually showed Caspian standing completely still for a moment. And to me, it looked like he was just confused rather than alarmed. His brain couldn't process the danger. The bear traveled the distance between them in seconds. So, by the time Caspian finally turned to run, the bear was already on him, slamming him violently into the grass. The attack unfolded in full view of dozens of horrified tourists. The bear bit into Caspian's upper body and neck, tossing him across the meadow before running off. Rangers and paramedics arrived within about 6 minutes. Responders found Caspian unconscious, with absolutely catastrophic injuries. When I looked at the medical details, it was just horrific, severe trauma to his head, neck, and chest caused massive, rapid blood loss. Despite emergency treatment right there on the grass, he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Investigators later recovered his phone, and personally, I find it heartbreaking that his final images and video clearly documented his gradual, step-by-step approach toward the bear. The coroner's report concluded that Caspian died from multiple traumatic injuries caused by a grizzly bear attack. The damage to his vital organs and major arteries was just too severe for any human to survive. The park's official investigation determined that the bear was just behaving like a normal wild animal, and that Caspian had deliberately moved closer despite explicit warnings from park staff and everyday tourists. The bear was never hunted down because officials ruled it had simply reacted to a human approaching too closely. For me, this whole case is just a brutal reminder of why those wildlife safety rules exist. It was July 19, 2017. A highway expansion project was underway outside Amarillo, Texas. Temperatures remained in the mid-90s degrees Fahrenheit as crews finished widening a busy stretch of roadway. Equipment operators at the project often spent the final part of their shift moving between machines and helping prepare equipment for the next morning. One of them was Shane Keegan, a 42-year-old operator who had already completed most of his responsibilities for the day. Having spent years working around heavy equipment, he was familiar with the routine routines that kept a project running smoothly and rarely needed supervision to get his work done. The day's production work was winding down, but several routine tasks still remained. Machinery needed to be parked, fluid levels checked, and fuel tanks topped off before crews returned the next morning. Shane had already finished work and was waiting for transportation home. While he waited, a coworker asked him a quick question about one of the machines he had been operating earlier that day. Shane walked back toward the staging area to take a look. Several pieces of equipment had been parked together near the edge of the project, and workers were moving between them, topping off fuel tanks and completing routine maintenance. Shane remained nearby, spending a few minutes talking with coworkers and looking over equipment as the work continued. For most of the crew, it was one of the least remarkable parts of the workday. The process was familiar, predictable, and repeated almost every evening. It's interesting how a job site can feel busiest and most relaxed at exactly the same time. At some point during the refueling process, a small amount of gasoline spilled onto the ground near a portable generator being topped off. As additional machines were serviced, the smell of gasoline became more noticeable throughout the staging area. With each machine that was serviced, the fuel odor became harder to ignore. Even so, most workers treated it as a normal part of the process. After spending all day around heavy equipment, fuel, asphalt, and engine exhaust, the smell simply seemed like another part of the environment. It's human nature to stop noticing things that never seem to change, and in a workplace that can create its own set of risks. By early evening, several recently operated machines remained warm from hours of use. Fuel vapors slowly accumulated near ground level between parked equipment while workers continued finishing their responsibilities. Nothing about the scene appeared urgent. Then, a flash suddenly appeared near the staging area. Flames raced across the ground almost instantly, spreading through the area where fuel vapors had accumulated. Workers nearest the ignition point moved away as the fire rapidly expanded between the parked machines. Shane was still standing near the row of equipment when the flash fire swept through the staging area. With the flames moving faster than anyone could react, he was caught within the path of the burning vapor cloud before he could reach a safe distance. Rather than a large explosion, the event unfolded as a fast-moving flash fire. Several workers heard a sharp, rushing sound as flames moved through the vapor cloud. Heat spread rapidly between parked machines, and visibility was briefly affected by smoke and fire. The entire incident lasted only seconds. Emergency calls were placed almost immediately, while nearby workers focused on helping those caught within the affected area. Activity across the project stopped as attention shifted entirely toward the emergency. Responders arrived within minutes, but the area first had to be secured before treatment efforts could continue safely. Investigators later determined that gasoline vapors accumulated near a portable generator during routine refueling operations before igniting somewhere within the staging area. Although the exact ignition source was never identified, the fire spread rapidly through the vapor-filled space between parked machines. Shane's death was ruled accidental. He died from thermal injuries sustained during the flash fire. Investigators cited gasoline spillage, vapor accumulation, and refueling activities as contributing factors. The affected work area remained closed for a week while the incident was investigated. It was June 15, 2019, at a public recreation area beside Lake Jesup in Florida. A company picnic had just ended, but several coworkers stayed behind to play one last volleyball game before heading home. The court was only a short walk from the shoreline, where large signs warned visitors not to enter the lake because alligators lived there. The signs had been there for years, but after spending the afternoon having fun, most people hardly noticed them anymore. One of the players was Meredith Floyd, a 28-year-old HVAC technician. She worked hard, enjoyed competition, and rarely backed away from a challenge. Friends knew she liked proving she could handle things that made other people hesitate. If someone questioned whether she would do something, Meredith usually answered with actions instead of words. Near the end of the game, a hard spike sent the volleyball bouncing down the grassy bank. It rolled through shoreline plants before stopping several yards from land in shallow water. Everyone walked over to look at it. One coworker laughed, pulled a $20 bill from a wallet, and jokingly said it belonged to whoever wanted to retrieve the ball. The rest of the group laughed because replacing the volleyball would have been far easier than stepping into a lake known for alligators. Meredith smiled and headed toward the shoreline. A few friends reminded her about the warning signs. Someone suggested finding a long branch. Another offered to ask a park employee for help. Meredith waved off every suggestion and kept walking. It's surprising how fast a joke turned into a challenge Meredith felt she had to win. She stepped around the safety railing and climbed onto the muddy bank. From the edge, she stretched as far as she could, but the volleyball stayed just beyond her reach. Instead of trying another solution, she slipped off her shoes and stepped into the water. Nothing happened. She took another careful step. Still nothing. After several more steps, the lake remained quiet. Seeing no danger, Meredith appeared to believe the warnings had been exaggerated. She continued toward the volleyball with growing confidence. Several anglers fishing nearby noticed her almost immediately. They began waving both arms and shouting for her to come back. Witnesses later said Meredith looked in their direction but did not stop. She stayed focused on the volleyball floating just ahead. As Meredith leaned forward to grab it, an alligator hidden beneath the surface suddenly attacked. Friends immediately called emergency services while everyone else backed away from the shoreline. Nobody entered the lake because they understood that doing so could place another person in danger. Deputies and medical crews arrived first and secured the area. Wildlife officers followed shortly afterward to manage the alligator hazard, while rescue efforts continued. Investigators later documented the section of shoreline where the volleyball had become trapped before Meredith entered the water. Those warning signs were only a few steps away, and somehow they still weren't enough. Meredith was recovered from the lake, but despite the rapid emergency response, she died from the severe injuries caused by the attack. The $20 didn't matter. Meredith was trying to prove a point, and that point ended up costing her life. The medical examiner ruled Meredith's cause of death as multiple traumatic injuries resulting from the alligator attack. Investigators confirmed through witness statements that Meredith voluntarily entered known alligator habitat to retrieve an inexpensive volleyball, despite repeated warnings from friends and nearby anglers. Friends later explained that the $20 offer had only been a joke and that no one expected her to accept it. After the incident, park managers temporarily restricted access to the shoreline, while wildlife officials reminded visitors never to enter alligator habitat to recover property. Investigators concluded that ignoring posted warnings led to a completely preventable tragedy. It was May 18, 2018, at the port of Savannah in Georgia. Long rows of steel shipping containers filled the yard, while trucks slowly moved cargo toward waiting ships. Most of the area was quiet during the night, with only workers preparing loads before sunrise. Valerius Tinnen was a 34-year-old former warehouse forklift operator who knew the port well from his old job. Earlier that evening, he had spent time with former co-workers but missed the last city bus home. Rather than paying for a motel for only a few hours, he decided to sleep somewhere dry until morning. Remembering that empty shipping containers often sat in the staging yard before being moved, he believed one would be a safe place to rest. I think almost everyone has tried to save money at some point, but some shortcuts end up costing far more than anyone expects. Walking through the storage area, Valerius found an empty steel container that had recently been unloaded from another ship. There was nothing inside except the bare metal floor. He climbed in with his backpack and left one cargo door open just a few inches so fresh air could flow inside while he slept. Later that night, terminal workers continued preparing containers for export. During a routine inspection, one employee noticed the door standing slightly open. Believing it had simply been left unsecured after unloading, the workers shut both heavy doors and locked the outside bars just as required before shipment. Once those locking bars were secured, there was no handle or release inside the container that could open the doors. From the outside, nothing suggested anyone was trapped inside. Security patrols passed through the yard, but the sealed container looked no different from hundreds of others waiting to be loaded. Not long before sunrise, the movement of a yard truck woke Valerius as the container was lifted and carried across the terminal. At first, he thought another worker had simply moved it to a different spot. He pushed against the doors with both hands, but they would not move. He pounded on the steel walls and yelled for help while the container was still in the busy yard. The noise from trucks, cranes, and other equipment drowned out his voice. After waiting in the loading area with many other containers, the steel box was eventually lifted aboard a cargo ship and stacked high among hundreds of others. Soon afterward, the ship left the port without anyone realizing a man was trapped inside. I always find stories like this crazy. They are hard to believe, but with billions of people in the world, I guess even the most unbelievable things can happen. As the hours passed, the small amount of trapped air inside became harder to breathe. Although the container was not perfectly airtight, it had very poor ventilation once the doors were locked and stacked among other containers. Every breath used more of the remaining oxygen while adding more carbon dioxide to the confined space. Valerius kept trying to force the doors open, but each attempt left him weaker. He removed his jacket and sat beside his backpack to catch his breath. After resting, he struggled back to his feet and pushed against the doors again, but they still would not move. He leaned against the wall for a moment before sliding down to the floor, too tired to keep standing. The lack of adequate fresh air continued to wear him down. He became thirsty, confused, and too weak to try the doors again. He pulled himself toward the cargo doors, hoping someone might hear him when the container was finally opened. His breathing became faster, but it brought less relief with every breath. Before the ship reached its first scheduled stop several days later, he lost consciousness and died inside the poorly ventilated container. Dock workers opened the container during routine unloading and found Valerius lying near the cargo doors with his backpack beside him. There were no signs of serious physical injuries. Investigators later reviewed security cameras and confirmed that he had entered the empty container on his own shortly after midnight. They concluded that terminal employees had followed normal loading procedures and found no evidence that anyone knew a person was inside before the container was sealed and loaded for export. An autopsy later confirmed that Valerius died accidentally from oxygen depletion and a dangerous buildup of carbon dioxide inside the poorly ventilated container after it remained closed for several days. After the incident, port officials increased overnight patrols around empty container storage areas and added stronger warnings reminding people never to enter shipping containers without permission. In my opinion, the saddest part is that Valerius only wanted a free place to sleep until morning, but that single decision quietly carried him hundreds of miles away before anyone even knew he was missing. It was July 23, 2017, at Lake Havasu, Arizona. People had gathered along the shoreline to enjoy the warm weather when an unusual challenge began drawing attention. The person at the center of it was Amethyst Hoyle, a 27-year-old seasonal recreation worker. Amethyst loved outdoor activities and had a reputation for creating unusual homemade projects. She especially enjoyed proving people wrong when they doubted her ideas. In the past, she had built several homemade floating devices and tested them near shore. Some worked better than others, but they had given her confidence in her ability to improvise. During the gathering, Amethyst announced that she planned to cross a stretch of open water using a raft she had built entirely from plastic coolers. The raft consisted of several coolers tied together with ropes and straps. The challenge was intended as a solo crossing. A few friends immediately questioned whether the design could handle waves once it got farther from shore. The disagreement quickly drew attention. More people gathered along the shoreline to watch the attempt. The more people doubted her, the more determined she seemed to become. Friends suggested wearing a life jacket during the crossing. Amethyst refused. She believed wearing one would undermine the demonstration because she wanted people to see that she trusted the raft completely. I have definitely had moments where somebody doubted me, and I wanted to prove them wrong. The difference is that most of those moments did not involve open water and a homemade raft. By late morning, dozens of people were watching from the shoreline. Wind was creating moderate waves across the lake, but Amethyst remained committed to the plan. Shortly before noon, she launched the raft. At first, everything appeared to be working. The coolers floated well, and the raft moved steadily away from shore as Amethyst increased the distance between herself and the beach. The thing about making a public challenge is that turning back gets harder once people are watching. Every foot she traveled away from shore probably felt like proof that the raft was working. As she moved farther into open water and well away from the shoreline, the conditions became more challenging. Waves repeatedly washed across the platform. The water shifted the raft's balance and placed stress on the ropes and straps holding everything together. Witnesses later reported seeing one of the coolers break away from the structure. That was the beginning of the failure. Witnesses reported that Amethyst continued trying to stabilize the raft after the first section detached. As the raft continued through the waves, additional connections started coming apart. The coolers themselves remained afloat, but the structure that kept them together was slowly disappearing. The platform twisted and became unstable beneath her feet. Then the raft rolled sharply to one side. Amethyst lost her footing and fell into the lake. By the time the raft failed, she had already traveled a significant distance from both shore and nearby boats. Boaters immediately noticed the emergency and began moving toward her location. In the water, Amethyst attempted to hold on to the separated coolers as they drifted apart. Wind and waves pushed the floating pieces apart, forcing her to move from one section to another. Witnesses observed her repeatedly losing contact with individual coolers as the waves separated her from them. None of the floating sections provided a stable platform large enough for her to climb onto and rest. Witnesses observed her becoming increasingly exhausted as she tried to stay with the drifting flotation pieces. As rescuers closed the distance, she eventually lost contact with the coolers altogether. Moments later, she disappeared beneath the surface. Emergency responders launched a search operation, and divers later located Amethyst underwater not far from the remains of the failed raft. Investigators recovered the separated coolers along with the ropes and straps that had connected them. Witness statements consistently described the raft gradually coming apart as it encountered waves farther from shore. The investigation found no evidence of foul play or medical emergency. Authorities concluded that the homemade raft was not suitable for crossing open water under those conditions. The death was ruled accidental drowning. It was July 19, 2014, in Sacramento, California. Evening temperatures still hovered around 90 degrees as lawn sprinklers soaked neighborhood backyards, leaving the ground wet. Julian Jones Varquez was 34 and had spent more than a decade in construction. Confidence was kind of his thing. He hated paying someone else to do a job he thought he could handle, even when people warned him he was cutting corners. Friends joked that asking for help was the one thing Julian simply refused to do. His divorce the year before only seemed to make that streak worse. He bought a modest fixer-upper and threw himself into rebuilding the backyard from scratch, determined to prove he was doing just fine on his own. Every new fence post, patio stone, and light fixture became part of that mission. That night's barbecue was the first time he'd invited everyone over to show off the finished yard. But while hanging the last string of lights, he realized it came up a couple of feet short. Most people would have called it a night and picked up another extension cord the next day. Julian wasn't most people. After spending a year proving he could do everything himself, there was no way he was leaving the job unfinished over a missing few feet. Julian knew twisting bare wires together and wrapping them with Scotch tape wasn't the proper way to extend a cord. He even had proper wire connectors somewhere in the garage, but with guests arriving any minute, he convinced himself a temporary fix would hold for one evening. When you're trying to finish one last task before people arrive, a few extra minutes can feel a lot longer than they actually are. He cut the ends off two old extension cords, twisted the copper wires together, wrapped them with Scotch tape, plugged everything in, and watched the lights come on. And at first, it was. The music was playing, the lights were glowing, and everything looked great. Then, just minutes before his guests showed up, he noticed a section of those lights was sagging right over the kids' inflatable pool. He paused for a moment. The grass below was wet from the sprinklers, and he knew the homemade splice was lying somewhere beneath it. Instead of unplugging the lights first, he decided he'd be careful and fix it while everything stayed powered. It would only take a few seconds. Still barefoot, he walked over and stepped into the shallow water to reach the sagging strand. However, when he pulled on the lights, that tension traveled straight to the taped splice hidden in the wet grass. The tape shifted, exposing the bare copper underneath. As Julian reached down to steady the cord, his hand made contact with the exposed wire. The current went straight through him, from his hand, across his chest, down his legs, and into the water. People who were there said he froze in place. His muscles locked so tightly he couldn't let go, and he remained standing for several terrifying seconds before collapsing backward against the pool. A friend rushed over but recoiled the instant he touched Julian and felt the shock. Someone else finally ran to the garage and shut off the breaker. They pulled him free and started CPR until paramedics arrived. The electrical current had already done catastrophic damage. He died at the hospital a short time later. The autopsy showed the electricity had passed through his chest and disrupted the normal electrical signals controlling his heart, sending it into ventricular fibrillation, a rhythm that prevents the heart from pumping blood. Investigators also noticed noted the homemade splice had no waterproof connectors, no electrical box, and no insulation beyond household Scotch tape. Combined with wet grass, standing water, and an older outdoor circuit that wasn't protected by a GFCI breaker, the setup became deadly the moment the exposed wire was touched. The barbecue never happened. In the weeks that followed, Julian's family tore out the homemade wiring and replaced it with properly installed electrical lines. They eventually finished the backyard the way he had wanted, but nobody ever held the celebration he had spent a year planning. For them, the yard became a reminder that Julian's biggest mistake wasn't trying to fix something himself. It was believing the rules didn't apply to him. It was March 24, 2018, inside a convention center in Columbus, Ohio. A regional science fair had just announced its winners. Students, teachers, and families walked through the exhibit hall while workers prepared the winning projects for public demonstrations. The hall remained open, but rope barriers surrounded one display where staff were repositioning a large backdrop. Signs clearly marked the work area as authorized personnel only. One of the students was Heidi Crook, a 19-year-old in her final year of high school. She had spent months building her project and believed this would finally be the competition where she finished in first place. Instead, she earned second. Heidi was bright and determined, but she struggled to accept losing. As more people gathered around the winning exhibit, she watched the attention slowly shift away from her project. The winning display stood beneath a tall, temporary backdrop supported by portable metal truss stands. Workers had temporarily loosened one stabilizing brace so the lightweight backdrop could be shifted into its final position. Until it was fully secured again, the structure remained stable only if left undisturbed, which was why visitors were being kept behind the rope barrier. Heidi stayed near the display, watching volunteers prepare for the presentation. The winners had not even begun speaking yet, but she had already decided she wanted to delay their big moment. She knew she could not change the judge's decision, but she believed she could at least spoil the celebration that everyone had come to watch. When several volunteers turned to help direct the growing crowd, she slipped beneath the barrier and walked into the restricted area. A volunteer immediately called for her to come back, believing she had crossed by mistake. Heidi ignored the warning and walked straight to the temporary support brace. Instead of touching the project, she grabbed the temporary support brace and gave it a firm shove, hoping the backdrop would shift enough to interrupt the presentation. What surprised me wasn't that Heidi was disappointed. It was that delaying someone else's success became more important than appreciating what she had already achieved. The first tug made the backdrop sway. The second caused one side to lean. Volunteers quickly moved visitors back while workers rushed toward the display. By then, it was obvious the backdrop was unstable. The nearest workers were only a few yards away, waving for Heidi to step back. Instead, she yanked the support once more. Witnesses later said that final pull shifted the loosened support farther than intended. Without it holding the backdrop steady, the structure tipped toward the restricted area. Heidi tried to move away, but the metal frame fell before she could escape. The demonstration was canceled immediately. Staff called emergency services while deputies, medical crews, and rescue workers secured the area and reached Heidi beneath the collapsed structure. By then, the frame had already started leaning and people were rushing toward her. I honestly don't know what she expected would happen after pulling it again. Heidi was taken to a nearby hospital, but despite emergency treatment, she later died from the severe injuries caused by the collapse. Second place was never what took Heidi's life. Trying to ruin first place did. The medical examiner ruled Heidi's cause of death as multiple blunt force injuries caused by the collapse of the temporary exhibition structure. Investigators found no evidence the display would have failed under normal conditions. They concluded the collapse began only after Heidi entered the restricted area and repeatedly disturbed the temporary support while workers were repositioning the backdrop. Witnesses confirmed she ignored the barrier, warning signs, repeated instructions to leave, and the visible movement of the structure before pulling the brace again. Organizers later strengthened supervision, improved barriers, and required temporary displays to be fully secured before visitors were allowed nearby. School officials also used the incident to remind students that respecting restricted areas matters just as much as respecting the outcome of a competition, no matter how disappointing the results may feel. The investigation ultimately showed that the judging itself had already ended and the winning project had not been damaged. Every serious consequence that followed came from Heidi's decision to interfere with equipment inside a clearly restricted area instead of accepting the results and walking away. It was September 14th, 2016. A bridge construction project was underway near Billings, Montana, where crews were assembling support systems for a new river crossing. Work had been progressing steadily throughout the afternoon. Not every concern on a construction site arrives as an emergency. Most turn out to be nothing, but every now and then, one of them deserves a closer look. That afternoon, several workers reported hearing occasional metallic snapping noises from one section of the project. The sounds were brief and infrequent, sometimes separated by 30 minutes or more. Most people continued working, assuming the noises were connected to normal construction activity. Eventually, the reports reached Randall Boone. Randall was a 48-year-old construction supervisor responsible for coordinating several operations across the site. He had developed a reputation for checking things himself whenever something seemed unusual. Rather than dismiss concerns, he preferred to see the situation firsthand. The reports all pointed toward the same area. A tensioned cable system had been installed as part of an ongoing structural operation. Several steel lines stretched between large anchor assemblies and were being used to stabilize components during construction. The system had been functioning without any major issues. Late that afternoon, one worker mentioned hearing another metallic snap. A few minutes later, a second worker reported hearing something similar from roughly the same location. At that point, Randall decided to take a look himself. A worker directed him toward the section where most of the sounds had been reported. As he approached, crews continued working nearby, and nothing immediately appeared unusual. Cables remained in place. The anchor assemblies appeared intact, and no visible damage stood out from a distance. Then, another metallic ping echoed across the work zone. Randall stopped and looked toward the cable system, expecting to see some sign of what had caused it, but nothing appeared to have moved. From where he stood, everything still looked completely normal. There's something very unsettling about hazards you can't actually see. A tensioned cable can appear completely motionless, while enormous forces remain stored inside it. Randall continued forward. As he reached the edge of the tensioning area, he paused and focused on the section of cable where the noises had reportedly been coming from. Another metallic snap echoed through the system. A split second later, the cable failed. The line had been weakening throughout the afternoon as individual wire strands gradually broke under tension. When the remaining strands could no longer support the load, the cable suddenly gave way. Thousands of pounds of stored force were released instantly. The steel line recoiled across the work zone at tremendous speed, whipping through the area before anyone had time to react. As it tore across the site, it struck equipment, loose materials, and everything in its way. Randall had stopped near the section of cable that had been producing the unusual noises. When the line failed, the recoiling cable swept across the area and struck him in the upper body with tremendous force. Emergency assistance was requested immediately through radios and cell phones as workers secured the area around the failed cable. Construction activity across the project was halted while the scene was documented and the damaged line was made safe. In the days that followed, sections of the failed cable were recovered and examined alongside maintenance records, photographs, and inspection documentation. Investigators found that multiple internal wire strands had fractured before the final break occurred. Those earlier failures were consistent with the metallic noises workers had reported. Throughout the afternoon, Randall died from traumatic injuries sustained when the recoiling cable struck him following the catastrophic failure. Evidence recovered from the scene helped investigators reconstruct the sequence of events and determine how the failure developed. Findings concluded that the incident was accidental. It was April 29, 2021, outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. Dark clouds covered the sky as light rain fell across open fields near a quiet county road. A few people had stopped along the roadside to photograph an approaching storm before the weather became too rough. One of them was Theodora Wakeen, a 26-year-old wedding photographer who spent many weekends taking pictures of severe storms. Weather reports had already warned about flash flooding because heavy rain was falling several miles upstream, even though only moderate rain was reaching them. As small hailstones began hitting the ground, everyone hurried back toward their parked vehicles. Theodora worried that the hail would damage the expensive camera equipment she used for work. If I had been standing there, I probably would have been watching the hail too. Doubt I would have been thinking about rain that had already fallen several miles away. Beside the road was a large concrete culvert that carried water beneath the roadway. From the entrance, it looked mostly dry except for a thin stream flowing across the bottom. Hoping to protect both herself and her camera until the hail passed, Theodora stepped several yards inside the wide tunnel. Several other storm watchers remained near the roadside and repeatedly called for her to come back out, reminding her that a flash flood warning had already been issued. Looking at the shallow water around her shoes, Theodora believed the warning did not yet apply to where she was standing. She decided to wait a little longer, convinced the hail would end before anything changed. Several miles upstream, powerful rainstorms were already filling creeks and drainage channels that emptied into the same culvert. None of that could be seen from the entrance where Theodora stood. Only a short time later, muddy water rushed into the tunnel. At first, it covered only her ankles. Realizing the water was rising, she grabbed her camera and hurried toward the entrance. After only a few steps, the water climbed past her knees and began pulling against her legs. Within moments, it reached her waist. Rocks, broken branches, and other debris raced through the tunnel with the growing current. Theodora tried to keep moving, but one foot slid across slick algae covering the concrete floor. She lost her balance and fell into the fast-moving water before reaching the opening. Several people along the roadside ran toward the entrance, but by then, the current had already carried her beyond where they could safely reach. The flood swept her about 40 feet through the concrete culvert as fast-moving rocks, heavy branches, and other debris repeatedly slammed into her body. She suffered broken ribs, a broken left arm, cuts to her scalp, and deep scrapes across much of her body. This is the part that always gets me. She could still see the opening, but the water was already moving faster than any person could outrun. Near the far end of the culvert, a large tree limb already being carried by the floodwater became trapped against the heavy steel grate covering the exit. The moving water forced Theodora sideways against the branch and the grate, pinning her chest tightly in place. The powerful current repeatedly pushed her head beneath the muddy water, leaving her unable to keep breathing. Swift water rescue crews arrived soon afterward, but the floodwater inside the narrow culvert was still moving with enough force to knock rescuers off their feet. Entering the tunnel immediately would have placed them in the same danger. They waited until the current began to slow before making their way inside. By the time rescuers removed the branch and reached Theodora, she had already drowned. Later that afternoon, rescue teams recovered her body after the floodwater receded. Engineers examined the concrete culvert and confirmed it had worked exactly as designed by carrying large amounts of floodwater beneath the roadway. Investigators also determined that the sudden rise in water came from intense rainfall several miles upstream, explaining why conditions at the entrance had appeared much safer only minutes earlier. The official cause of death was identified as Theodora died accidentally from drowning after suffering multiple blunt force injuries while being carried through the flood channel. Following the tragedy, local emergency officials installed stronger warning signs near major culverts and later used the incident during flash flood safety campaigns to remind people that drainage culverts are built to move floodwater, never to provide shelter from storms. I keep coming back to the same thinking. The place that looked like the safest shelter had actually been built for one purpose only: to send floodwater through as quickly as possible. It was October 17, 2018, at a construction site on the outskirts of Houston, Texas. Although workers had left for the evening, parts of the site's electrical system remained energized behind warning signs and protective fencing. The man at the center of this story was Ian Knowles, a 34-year-old scrap metal scavenger and occasional day laborer. Ian was known for searching construction sites after hours looking for materials he could sell. Copper was usually his main target because it could bring in quick cash. According to people who knew him, he often bragged that construction security was easy to get around. A short time before the incident, another scrap collector told Ian about thick copper conductors visible from outside the fencing. The conductors were part of the site's electrical system and looked valuable enough to attract attention. With copper prices increasing, Ian saw an opportunity to make money. After sunset, he arrived carrying gloves, wire cutters, and a backpack. Rather than leave when he saw the warning signs, he walked around the perimeter looking for a way inside. Eventually, he climbed over the fence. Residents living in nearby apartment buildings later reported seeing a man moving through the illuminated construction site. Ian appeared to be heading directly toward a section containing electrical equipment. From outside an inner enclosure, he could already see the copper conductors he had come to collect. I can understand why the copper caught his attention. When money is tight, an easy score can look a lot more tempting than it should. To reach the conductors, Ian crossed a second barrier installed around energized equipment. The extra fencing existed to keep unauthorized people away from dangerous components, but he climbed over it anyway. Once inside, he positioned himself beside the installation and began trying to remove one of the conductors. The copper was firmly bonded to the system and could not be pulled free by hand. Ian tugged on it repeatedly before switching to his cutting tool. When that failed, he continued adjusting his position in an effort to reach the attachment point. The farther he reached into the enclosure, the closer he moved to energize components. That should have been enough to tell him the situation was more dangerous than he expected. But Ian continued. He reached deeper into the enclosure and attempted to place the cutter closer to where the conductor was attached. During that effort, the metal tool contacted a live electrical component. A powerful electrical arc erupted instantly. Witnesses described a bright flash that lit up the area and drew attention from surrounding buildings. The arc produced an intense burst of heat and energy. At the same time, the force of the blast threw Ian backward onto the gravel several feet away. The heat generated by the event was extreme. Portions of his clothing ignited, and he suffered catastrophic burn injuries. Several people immediately called emergency services after seeing the flash and the aftermath. There are so many moments in this story where Ian could have turned around, climbing the first fence, crossing the second barrier, getting closer and closer to energized equipment. Every one of those moments was a chance to leave. Responders arrived a short time later, but Ian's injuries were unsurvivable. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators documented severe electrical damage at the point of contact. Witness statements helped establish the sequence of events. Physical evidence showed that Ian entered multiple restricted areas while attempting to remove copper from the energized installation. After the investigation, officials concluded that Ian trespassed into restricted sections of the site and attempted to steal copper conductors connected to energized equipment. Based on witness accounts, physical evidence, and damage at the scene, investigators determined that his metal cutting tool contacted a live electrical component, triggering the arc flash that caused his fatal injuries. The death was ruled an accidental electrocution during an attempted theft. It was September 22, 2017, in Dayton, Ohio. Overnight rain had cleared, leaving a cool morning in the low 70s. Dave Leonard's garage was packed with old tools, cardboard boxes, newspapers, and projects waiting to be repaired instead of replaced. 52-year-old Dave had spent 30 years as a maintenance technician at a nearby auto parts plant. Around the neighborhood, he was the guy everyone called when something broke, and after decades of fixing things, he had developed a quiet confidence that sometimes crossed into stubbornness. Dave hated throwing anything away. If a manufacturer said something couldn't be repaired, he took it as a personal challenge. Friends joked that he trusted his own experience more than warning labels. And honestly, most of the time, that confidence seemed earned. That mindset had filled one corner of his garage with old cordless tool batteries, laptop batteries, and vacuum packs he was certain still had some life left in them. Over the years, he'd built up this massive pile of old lithium-ion batteries in that corner, stuff he'd pulled from old drills, laptops, and vacuums. He kept telling himself he'd eventually rebuild them into usable battery packs instead of paying for replacements. Recycling them felt like admitting defeat, and buying new ones felt like wasting perfectly good parts. So, that Friday, he finally decided it was time to sort through the pile and salvage whatever he thought could still be saved. This is the part that really gets me. Dave didn't think he was doing anything reckless. He'd watched a few online repair videos, skimmed a couple of forum posts, and convinced himself he understood lithium batteries well enough to handle them. That's the problem with a little knowledge. Sometimes it gives you just enough confidence to ignore the people who actually know what they're talking about. He dragged the box of swollen batteries onto his workbench, planning to separate the good cells from the bad ones. The bench itself was buried under cardboard, newspapers, and oily rags, but Dave had worked around clutter for years and didn't see it as a problem. He grabbed the first swollen pack, held it against the wood, and jammed a screwdriver screwdriver into the casing, believing releasing the pressure would make it safe to take apart. For a split second, nothing happened, and I can almost feel the tension in the room right then. Then it hissed. That punctured cell started venting hot gas, and it caught fire instantly, spitting flames across the bench. Dave panicked naturally and dropped the burning pack right into that pile of newspapers. The fire spread to the cardboard, and then, as I'm sure you've guessed, it started heating up all the other damaged batteries in the stack. It turned into a total chain reaction. One after another, those packs went into thermal runaway, popping and spraying burning chemicals everywhere. Within seconds, thick black smoke filled the ceiling and started pouring down toward the floor. Dave grabbed his fire extinguisher from the back wall, but it was already too late. By the time he got it, he couldn't even see his own hands in the smoke, and that, to me, is just pure nightmare fuel. He started coughing, desperately stumbling toward the side door, but he tripped over some storage boxes. He went down just a few feet from the exit, and he simply couldn't get back up before the smoke overcame him. A neighbor out walking her dog heard the popping sounds, saw the smoke, and called 911 at 9:14 a.m. Firefighters were there in 6 minutes. They put it out fast, but Dave was already gone, and it's just heartbreaking to think how close he was to making it out. The coroner later said he died from inhaling the smoke and carbon monoxide. It's truly hard for me to even think about, but the burns in his airway meant he was alive and breathing while the fire was spreading. The smoke, not the flames, is what did it, which feels even more cruel to me. Investigators later found several battery packs neatly lined up on the workbench, each marked with masking tape that read, "Good and test." Dave hadn't been cleaning the garage because he had finally given up on them. He genuinely believed he was rescuing valuable parts that everyone else would have thrown away. That is the absolute worst part. You spend all that time building a future for someone you love, and then something so preventable stops it all in its tracks. It just breaks my heart. The fire department eventually used his story in community talks, just begging people, please, never puncture or crush a lithium-ion battery. Don't try to be a hero with this stuff. Just take them to a certified recycling spot. It's not worth the risk. If you take anything away from this, please, just listen to the professionals. Those batteries are essentially small bombs when they're damaged. Just get rid of them the right way. It's really not worth losing your life over a few old drills. It was September 18th, 2021, inside a small apartment building in Austin, Texas. A birthday party was coming to an end, and guests were gathering their things while waiting for rides home. The building had both an elevator and a stairwell, and people used whichever was closest. It felt like an ordinary evening, with nothing to suggest that a few rushed decisions were about to change everything. One of the guests was Bethany Dowd, a 26-year-old restaurant server. Long shifts had made her used to moving fast, and she hated waiting when she thought there was a quicker option. Friends often laughed about how she rushed through almost everything. As the party wound down, her only goal that night was getting home before her rideshare driver left. Earlier in the evening, another guest accidentally dropped a banana peel while carrying snacks downstairs. The peel came to rest beside the wall near the first landing, just outside the main walking path. A few people noticed it, stepped around it, and assumed someone else would throw it away. As more guests passed through the stairwell, everyone avoided it, but nobody stopped to pick it up. Bethany had already reached the lobby when she realized she had left her phone upstairs. She hurried back, picked it up, and immediately saw a notification warning that her rideshare driver would leave if she was not outside soon. One friend reminded her she could request another ride in less than a minute if this one left. Another even offered to wait with her. Witnesses later said Bethany brushed off the suggestion and headed straight for the stairwell instead. The elevator was still stopping on other floors, and waiting for it felt like wasting time. Bethany held her phone in one hand, her keys in the other, and began walking down the stairs without using the handrail. Bethany wasn't rushing because of an emergency. She was trying to save a few minutes, and somehow those few minutes started feeling more valuable than slowing down. She hurried down the stairs, glancing at her rideshare app every few steps instead of keeping her full attention on where she was walking. As she reached the first landing, she looked down at the screen one more time. Her smooth-soled shoe slid across the banana peel before she had time to react. Already off balance from moving too quickly, Bethany lost her footing. She fell hard onto the landing before tumbling down the remaining section of the stairwell. Friends reached her within seconds, while other guests and nearby residents called emergency services. Everyone helped keep the area clear, and Bethany was kept as still as possible until medical crews arrived. The banana peel may have been the last thing she stepped on, but I honestly don't think it was the biggest mistake. By then, she had already ignored almost every safer choice she could have made. Police documented the stairwell, including the discarded banana peel, and interviewed witnesses. Despite emergency treatment at a nearby hospital, Bethany later died from the severe injuries she suffered in the fall. The medical examiner ruled her cause of death as multiple blunt force injuries sustained in the stairway fall. It's easy to believe saving a few minutes is worth hurrying. Looking back at this case, those few minutes ended up costing far more than Bethany could ever have imagined. Investigators concluded that Bethany's fatal fall resulted from a series of avoidable decisions, including rushing, checking her rideshare app, and not using the handrail, rather than any defect in the building. They also noted that the discarded banana peel had remained in the shared stairwell after multiple guests walked past it. Building management later reminded residents to keep common walkways clear of debris, while authorities emphasized that rushing through everyday situations can quickly turn ordinary hazards into preventable tragedies. It was August 22nd, 2017, behind a family restaurant in Phoenix, Arizona. The dinner rush had ended, the dishes were clean, and the last employees were getting ready to head home. Behind the building sat a large commercial dumpster, filled mostly with flattened cardboard boxes, empty food packaging, and sealed trash bags waiting for the next pickup. One of the employees finishing her shift was Ione Ziana, a 21-year-old dishwasher who was known for pulling practical jokes around the restaurant. She enjoyed surprising her co-workers with harmless pranks, and after a long, exhausting shift, she thought ending the night with one final joke would lift everyone's spirits. Garbage was usually collected on certain mornings, and she mistakenly believed the restaurant's opening crew would arrive before the sanitation truck. In her mind, she would only have to stay hidden for a short while before the first employees came outside with more trash. Sounded really optimistic. I enjoy a good prank too, but hiding where heavy equipment is supposed to work is a risk I would never take. After everyone believed she had gone home, Ione quietly walked back behind the restaurant. She climbed into the dumpster where there was still enough room between the cardboard and trash bags to hide. She pulled several flattened boxes over herself until she could no longer be seen from above. Satisfied with her hiding place, she settled in to wait for what she expected would be an early morning surprise for her co-workers. A little later, Marcus Neal, the kitchen manager, locked the restaurant and left with the remaining employees. Nobody realized Ione was still on the property. The building sat dark and quiet for the rest of the night while she remained hidden inside the dumpster. Believing she still had plenty of time before anyone arrived, she eventually drifted off to sleep. Shortly after sunrise, a commercial front-loading garbage truck entered the parking lot on its normal route. The driver stopped beside the dumpster and completed his usual walk around before collecting it. Looking down from the top, he saw only stacked cardboard and sealed trash bags covering the bottom. Nothing suggested a person was hidden underneath. The sound of the truck woke Ione. She heard the engine outside and realized the garbage truck had arrived before the restaurant's opening crew. She quickly pushed the cardboard away and tried to sit up, planning to climb out before anyone noticed. Before she could reach the top edge, the truck's lifting arms locked onto the dumpster. The entire container suddenly lurched upward. As it tilted over the truck, loose cardboard and heavy trash bags slid toward the opening. The shifting weight knocked Ione off balance. She grabbed for the side of the dumpster, but lost her grip as the contents rushed past her. She fell headfirst into the truck's receiving hopper, along with hundreds of pounds of trash. The dumpster was lowered back onto the ground, and the driver, believing the load had emptied normally, activated the hydraulic packing blade to make room for the next pickup. The heavy steel plate slowly pushed the trash forward inside the hopper. Ione became trapped between the moving refuse and the front wall of the truck. The crushing pressure caused catastrophic injuries to her head, chest, pelvis, and legs, along with severe internal injuries. This is where everything changed. Once that packing blade started moving, there was almost no chance of stopping it. During the compaction cycle, the driver noticed the truck responding differently than it normally did. The hydraulic system strained against unexpected resistance, and several heavy impacts echoed from inside the hopper. Realizing something was wrong, he immediately stopped the machine and called for emergency assistance. Rescue crews arrived within minutes but faced a difficult recovery. They spent hours carefully taking apart sections of the garbage truck before they could safely reach Ione. She had already died from the severe crushing injuries. Following the accident, Ione's family explored legal action against both the restaurant and the garbage company. However, investigators found that the truck had been operating normally. The driver had followed standard collection procedures, and no mechanical defects contributed to the tragedy. Officials ultimately ruled the death an accident caused by Ione's decision to hide inside the dumpster. What stays with me is that everyone thought they were starting a normal workday. Nobody expected someone to be hiding inside that dumpster. It was May 11, 2017. A high-rise construction project was underway in Denver, Colorado, where crews were building a new office tower. By midday, workers were preparing for one of the largest concrete pours on the project. Brill Tatum was a 34-year-old concrete worker assigned to the pour crew. Unlike many of the workers handling equipment from ground level, much of his shift was spent several stories above the site on an elevated platform attached to the formwork system. Large concrete pours depend heavily on temporary structures. Before concrete hardens, it behaves like a dense liquid, pushing outward against the forms designed to contain it. The larger the pour, the greater the pressure placed on those temporary systems. That morning, crews spent hours preparing the area. Form panels were assembled, supports were checked, and workers moved into position before the first concrete arrived. Once placement began, the operation settled into a steady rhythm as load after load was directed into the forms. Brill's job required him to monitor conditions from above. From the platform, he could watch how the concrete settled, observe the formwork, and relay information to workers handling different parts of the pour. From that position, small changes were often easier to notice than they were from the ground. The formwork supporting the pour would eventually be removed and discarded, but for now, thousands of pounds of concrete depended entirely on it. Shortly after noon, a small amount of concrete began seeping from a connection point near one section of the formwork. At first, it looked minor. A thin stream of wet concrete slowly worked its way through the seam and down the side of the structure. Workers noticed it, but the flow remained limited. Brill kept an eye on it while continuing his responsibilities. Over the next several minutes, however, the leak became more noticeable. The stream widened. Then, more concrete appeared around the connection. From his position above, Brill could see workers below beginning to focus their attention on the same area. Rather than remaining where he was, he walked along the platform to get a closer look at the section where the leak was developing. People often think construction is about building things, but a lot of the job is simply paying attention. So the closer he got, the more obvious the problem became. Concrete was no longer simply seeping through the connection. It was actively forcing its way out. Then, the formwork shifted. The movement was small, but it was enough. A support connection failed. The weakened section gave way almost immediately afterward. Concrete began forcing its way through the opening almost immediately. As pressure escaped through the failed section, nearby panels separated and parts of the formwork collapsed outward. Brill was standing only a short distance away when it happened. As the formwork failed, part of the platform beneath him dropped unexpectedly. He lost his footing as the structure shifted and was thrown from the elevated work area. Several stories below, debris, broken panels, support components, and wet concrete crashed into the work zone almost simultaneously. Workers immediately called for emergency assistance, while others focused on clearing the area beneath the damaged structure and checking on nearby personnel. Brill was located within the collapse area as responders and workers carefully worked through fallen formwork, debris, and concrete around the scene. Recovered formwork components, inspection records, photographs, and construction documentation were later examined to determine how the collapse developed. Investigators found that a critical connection within the formwork system failed under load, allowing concrete to escape and triggering the collapse of the surrounding structure. Brill died from traumatic injuries sustained during the collapse and fall. The incident was ruled accidental, and investigators concluded that the failed connection initiated the sequence that brought down the formwork. Local coverage of the collapse focused on the investigation and the temporary suspension of work in the affected area while the site was assessed. It was February 11, 2020, inside a manufacturing facility in Amarillo, Texas. Employees were expected to use designated walkways that kept them away from moving conveyor systems. One of the employees working that day was Tamara Galt, a 41-year-old industrial maintenance technician. She had spent years around production equipment and knew the facility well. Co-workers viewed her as experienced and confident. They also knew she had a habit of taking shortcuts whenever she thought it would save a little time. Over the years, Tamara had developed a routine of crossing through equipment areas rather than using approved walkways. She often stepped over inactive conveyors instead of walking around them. According to co-workers, she had also been seen crossing near operating equipment on other occasions. Nothing ever went wrong. After doing it successfully so many times, the shortcut became part of her normal workday. Co-workers saw it often enough that most barely reacted anymore. It was simply something Tamara did. On the day of the incident, she was carrying paperwork and a few small tools while moving between work areas. To reach her destination, she could either follow the designated route around a production line or take a much shorter path across a conveyor system standing between her and where she needed to go. Unlike many of the conveyors she had crossed in the past, this one was operating and slowly moving materials along the belt. Surveillance footage later showed Tamara approaching the conveyor and stopping briefly near it. She appeared to look at the moving belt before making her decision. No employees were close enough to reach her before she attempted the shortcut. Instead of heading toward the approved crossing point, Tamara chose the shortcut. She had crossed similar areas so many times that the moving belt may not have seemed like a major obstacle. Rather than walk around the line, she placed one foot onto the conveyor while attempting to cross over it. As the belt continued moving beneath her foot, her balance shifted unexpectedly while she tried to step over part of the conveyor structure. The movement threw off her footing. As she attempted to recover, one foot slipped into a gap where moving parts came together and became trapped. The trapped foot immediately pulled her off balance and drew her into the equipment. Within moments, the conveyor dragged more of her lower body into the machinery as she struggled to free herself. Workers farther down the production line heard shouting and turned toward the conveyor. By the time they realized what was happening, Tamara had already become severely entangled. Several employees immediately ran toward the nearest emergency stop station. I have worked in places where people develop little routines like this. After enough days go by without anything bad happening, the shortcut starts feeling like part of the job instead of a risk. The shutdown system was activated as soon as workers reached it. Even after the stop control was pressed, the conveyor continued moving briefly before gradually coming to a halt. The remaining movement of the belt tightened the entrapment before the system finally stopped. Employees rushed to help while emergency services were called. Responders arrived within minutes, but the injuries caused by the entrapment were catastrophic. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage and interviewed co-workers. The video showed Tamara voluntarily attempting to cross the operating conveyor instead of using a designated crossing point. Employees confirmed that she had relied on similar shortcuts for years. Inspectors found no evidence of equipment failure or mechanical defects. The conveyor and emergency stop system were functioning properly. What makes this case so difficult to hear is that nothing had to malfunction. Everything worked exactly as intended, except for the choice to enter an area that was never meant to be crossed. Based on video evidence, witness statements, and inspection findings, investigators concluded that the fatal sequence began when Tamara entered an active conveyor system instead of using a designated walkway. Her death was ruled accidental, with the cause identified as crushing injuries sustained after becoming trapped in moving machinery. It was October 11, 2016, at Grand Canyon National Park's South Rim in Arizona. As evening approached, tourists gathered at the overlooks while rangers monitored the trails under clear skies. But right in the middle of that crowd were 28-year-old Gail Robinson and 31-year-old Brian Green. Gail ran a small travel channel focused on outdoor spots. He edited videos for local businesses just to get by, and personally, I can totally relate to this. He spent nearly every spare dollar trying to make his channel blow up. His friends said he was energetic, ambitious, and always hunting for unique footage. Then you had Brian, who was chasing the exact same dream. He was a freelance photographer whose online growth had been painfully slow. If you've ever tried to build something online, you know how soul-crushing that can be. And for me, it's easy to see how he fell into a bad headspace. Brian was constantly tracking other creators' numbers, and over time, he'd actually developed this quiet, bitter social media rivalry with Gail. They were always trying to prove who could make the better content. That night, both of them ended up at a travel media meetup right around the main overlook. As sunset got closer, Gail started complaining that everyone was capturing the exact same boring footage. Brian agreed, but what frustrates me is that they immediately started debating who could find the most extreme angle before the sun went down. Now, just a short distance away, there were several warning signs advising people to stay on the marked trails because the ground near the rim is incredibly unstable. But neither Gail nor Brian paid attention. Personally, I think they had total tunnel vision. They were completely fixated on getting their shots. Pretty soon, they walked away from the crowd and stepped onto an unofficial rocky ledge way past the safety area. Other tourists noticed them getting way too close to the edge, and one person even yelled out a warning. But you know how ego works. Witnesses said both men just laughed it off and kept recording. Neither one wanted to back down and lose this unspoken competition. As the sun dipped lower, Gale started filming a wide-angle shot while walking backward, his eyes glued to his camera screen. Brian was standing just a few feet away, totally wrapped up in his own footage. When I think about this moment, it honestly makes my stomach turn. Neither man was looking at the actual ground. Without warning, Gale stepped onto loose gravel right at the edge. His feet shot out from under him, and his body went backward. Tourists heard him scream as he started sliding toward the drop. Brian lunged forward and managed to grab Gale's forearm right before he went over. For a few agonizing seconds, Brian actually held onto him. Witnesses described a violent, terrifying struggle as loose stones kept breaking free. Gale's weight pulled Brian closer and closer to the edge. Brian tried to brace himself. The ground shifted again, and both men slid forward together. It's hard for me to even imagine the horror of the crowd as they watched both of them disappear over the rim in an instant, because darkness and the steep terrain made a nighttime recovery too dangerous. Rescue teams secured the area and waited until first light to descend. Recovery teams reached the area the next morning. Investigators later recovered the cameras, and the footage showed both men focused on their screens rather than the ground around them. The medical examiner found that both died within minutes from massive blunt force injuries caused by the fall. What stays with me is that the cameras captured exactly how it happened. For a few seconds, their attention shifted from the cliff to getting the perfect shot. It was January 8, 2015, in Chicago. A winter storm had knocked out power across several neighborhoods, leaving thousands of homes without heat as temperatures dropped well below freezing. Inside Chloe Bennett's apartment, the cold grew worse with every passing hour. Chloe was 29, and she just signed her first solo lease after years of living with roommates. She was working a standard customer service job, just trying to get by, and she had this little side blog where she'd show off thrifted furniture she'd fixed up herself. She was the type of person who'd rather do things her own way than ask for help, but after the move, she was pretty much tapped out on cash. It's that stubborn independence we all have, right? You want to prove you can handle it, but sometimes that mindset is exactly what puts you in a corner. When the power went, a hotel wasn't an option, and she couldn't afford an electrician either. Instead, she started searching online for quick ways to heat a room without electricity. One suggestion kept coming up: use a small outdoor fire bowl or charcoal burner near an open window. It sounded simple, cheap, and according to people online, perfectly safe if the room had enough ventilation. She had a small metal fire bowl meant for outdoor patios. Believing the advice she'd read, she carried it onto the tile by the balcony door and cracked the door open about 3 inches. She thought that would let the dangerous gases escape while keeping the warmth inside. What she didn't realize was that carbon monoxide builds up silently, and a small opening isn't enough to make an indoor fire safe. The worst part is that almost every safeguard failed at the same time. Her carbon monoxide detector wasn't even working. She'd taken it off the wall during the move and left it in a kitchen drawer with dead batteries, planning to reinstall it later. She lit the wood, and it caught fast. She felt so relieved, sitting on the couch wrapped in a blanket, even texting a friend that she was going to make it through the night. While the wind outside kept howling, inside, that invisible odorless gas started filling the room. For the first hour, everything seemed totally normal. The fire was glowing. She was finally relaxing, but then a headache kicked in. She blamed it on the stress of the day. Then came the dizziness and this heavy, sinking exhaustion. She thought she just needed a nap. She pulled the blanket up, closed her eyes, and that was it. She didn't wake up. By the next day, she didn't show up for work. And when her supervisor finally got the building manager to check on her, they found her just like that, still under the blanket on the couch. It's just such a brutal way to go. The medical examiner said it was accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. Her body was still breathing, but because that gas binds to your red blood cells way faster than oxygen does, her heart and brain just slowly starved until they shut down. In the months that followed, Chloe's family cleared out the house and eventually sold it. Before putting it on the market, they made sure working carbon monoxide detectors were installed on every level of the home. Friends later said they hoped anyone who lived there next would never have to learn the same lesson the way Chloe did. All it took was following bad advice, using a product in a way it was never designed to be used, and leaving one small safety device in its box instead of on the wall. It was August 14th, 2022, in Tampa, Florida. The afternoon was hot, and the small reptile room inside a private home was quiet, except for the steady hum of ventilation fans. The shelves, enclosures, and equipment were neatly arranged, making everything feel familiar and routine. I've heard experienced reptile keepers say the most dangerous snake in the room is often the one you've handled the most. I didn't fully understand that idea until I started reading incidents like this. Erica Nolan was 31 years old and worked in an office position during the week, but caring for reptiles had become the hobby she dedicated most of her free time to. She legally kept several venomous species and had spent years learning proper care, enclosure maintenance, and safe handling techniques. Friends admired how calm and methodical she was around dangerous animals. Unfortunately, years without an accident slowly replaced healthy caution with quiet confidence. Cleaning the enclosures had become almost automatic. A snake hook always rested beside the rattlesnake's enclosure. But after countless uneventful cleanings, Erica had developed a shortcut. During previous maintenance sessions, she had lightly guided the snake by hand, just long enough to wipe one corner before closing the enclosure again. Every successful attempt convinced her the routine was safe. That afternoon, two fellow reptile hobbyists had stopped by to exchange supplies and spend time discussing their collections. One of them noticed the unused snake hook and asked whether she planned to use it before cleaning. Erica brushed off the suggestion, explaining that she only needed to move the snake a few inches. She opened the enclosure and reached inside. As she tried to guide the rattlesnake away from one section, the snake coiled, rattled repeatedly, and held a defensive posture. Even then, Erica decided not to stop and retrieve the hook. In her mind, pausing now would only delay a task she believed was almost finished. She extended her hand one final time. The more I've learned about experienced hobbyists, the more one pattern keeps showing up. Serious mistakes usually don't begin with recklessness. They begin with routines that slowly stop feeling like risks. According to the official reconstruction, Erica's fingertips entered the snake's striking range as she attempted to move its body away from the corner of the enclosure. The rattlesnake reacted with a single rapid defensive strike, biting her hand, before immediately releasing and retreating into a tight defensive coil. Erica instinctively pulled her hand back and stepped away from the enclosure, while her friends closed and secured the enclosure to prevent any further danger. They immediately called emergency services and helped keep her as calm and still as possible while waiting for paramedics. At first, Erica believed the bite might not be severe because she remained alert and remembered several previous close calls that had ended without injury. As the minutes passed, however, pain intensified. Swelling spread steadily from her hand toward her forearm, and she began showing additional signs of serious envenomation. Paramedics arrived and started emergency treatment before transporting Erica to a regional hospital experienced in treating venomous snake bites. Doctors administered antivenom, monitored her condition closely, and provided supportive care. But severe complications developed despite aggressive treatment. One detail really stayed with me after reading about this case. The rattlesnake never behaved unpredictably. It reacted exactly the way a threatened rattlesnake is expected to react, and that puts the focus back on the decision that placed a hand within striking distance. Despite intensive medical care, Erica died from complications caused by the venomous snake bite. The medical examiner ruled her official cause of death as complications of venomous snake envenomation. Wildlife officials confirmed the rattlesnake had been legally possessed under the required permits and that the enclosure met applicable safety requirements. Investigators found no equipment failure or enclosure defect, and the unused snake hook remained beside the enclosure throughout the incident. Professional reptile organizations later referenced the case in safety education, emphasizing that specialized handling tools exist because even a captive venomous snake never stops behaving like a wild animal. What I remember most isn't the bite itself. It's the image of a safety tool sitting only a few feet away, ready to help. If only it had been part of the routine that day. It was August 8th, 2018. A commercial construction project was underway near Tacoma, Washington, where crews were assembling the framework of a large warehouse facility. Part of Jesse Ray Norcross's job involved documenting installation progress and checking alignment measurements as construction moved forward. The 29-year-old field technician spent much of his day moving between work areas, recording information, taking measurements, and relaying updates to supervisors and crews. Unlike many workers assigned to a single location, Jesse was constantly on the move. That morning, steel components were being lifted into position by a crane operating near the center of the project. As each section was installed, measurements had to be verified before work could continue. Jesse had already completed several inspections before being asked to check alignment measurements on a recently installed section of framework. The location was only a short walk away. Carrying a clipboard, measuring equipment, and a handheld device used for documentation, he headed toward the area while crane operations continued nearby. Large construction projects often involve multiple tasks happening at the same time. While one crew installs materials, another may be measuring, inspecting, documenting, or preparing the next stage of work. Sometimes I think that's what makes large construction projects so fascinating. Hundreds of people can be contributing to the same project while seeing completely different parts of it. As Jesse approached the framework, workers above were preparing another steel component for lifting. The piece weighed several tons and had been attached to lifting rigging connected to the crane. Once raised, it would be moved a relatively short distance before installation. Nothing about the lift appeared unusual. Jesse reached the section he had been assigned to inspect and began taking measurements. The work required him to remain near the base of the framework while crane operations continued nearby. It was common practice on the project for inspection and lifting operations to run concurrently, provided ground workers stayed within marked safe zones. The boundaries had been established during the planning phase, but no one had flagged a conflict between Jesse's assigned location and the active lift overhead. From ground level, it can be difficult to appreciate just how much movement occurs during a lift. Even when a suspended load appears stable, weight is constantly shifting through cables, rigging, and connection points. While Jesse continued taking measurements, the lift progressed overhead without any obvious signs of trouble. No alarm sounded, and from the ground, everything appeared normal. The steel component was nearly in position when part of the rigging suddenly failed. One side of the suspended load lost support, causing the section to lurch sideways before dropping from the assembly. Workers immediately shouted warnings. Jesse looked up toward the movement above him, but by then, the load was already falling. The steel component struck the area where he was working and hit him with tremendous force. He was knocked to the ground immediately, suffering extensive injuries to his chest, shoulders, and upper body, along with severe internal trauma from the impact. Nearby workers rushed toward the scene as debris scattered across the work area. Several workers immediately called for emergency assistance, while others moved into the area to help. Crane operations stopped at once, and personnel were directed away from the scene as crews accounted for everyone working nearby. Jesse remained near the base of the framework while responders worked to reach him. Construction activity across the project was suspended as the area was secured and documented. Investigators later focused heavily on the failed rigging assembly. The damaged component was recovered and examined alongside lift plans, inspection records, maintenance documentation, and photographs taken at the scene. Their findings showed that a rigging component had been damaged before the lift began. Under load, the weakened part failed and caused the suspended steel section to fall. The incident was ultimately ruled an accident. Jesse died from traumatic injuries sustained when the steel component fell from the crane assembly. Evidence recovered from the site helped investigators reconstruct the lift and determine how the rigging failure occurred. It was July 30th, 2022, at an abandoned agricultural pumping station outside Bakersfield, California. Most of the buildings had already been emptied, and workers had begun getting the property ready for demolition. Temporary fencing, warning signs, and barriers surrounded several structures that were no longer considered safe to enter. That afternoon, Cressida Bousel, a 31-year-old HVAC technician, arrived with her friend Noah Pierce, an electrician who shared her interest in exploring old industrial sites. Cressida loved photographing forgotten places and posting pictures of unusual machinery and buildings. Most of the time, she stayed outside fences and photographed whatever she could see from a distance, but every now and then, she convinced herself that stepping a little farther would lead to a better view. That day, one large steel water tank caught her attention. because it looked untouched compared to the rest of the property. I think curiosity is one of the easiest things to justify in the moment, especially when nothing around you looks dangerous. The tank stood several feet above the ground with an access hatch at the top. Around it were temporary barriers and signs warning people not to enter because it was a confined space. The tank had recently been drained, but contractors had intentionally left several feet of water and thick sediment at the bottom until special equipment could remove it later that week. Looking through the open hatch, however, the inside appeared dark and empty. While Noah stayed outside taking pictures of nearby equipment, Cressida stepped past the barrier and climbed onto the tank. She opened the secured hatch and shined her flashlight inside. From where she stood, the beam disappeared into darkness before reaching the bottom. Believing the tank was empty, she decided to climb down the fixed steel ladder for a better photograph. At first, everything seemed normal. She slowly made her way down while holding her flashlight in one hand and the ladder with the other. Years of moisture had badly weakened the metal inside the tank, but that damage was difficult to notice from above. About halfway down, one of the ladder rungs suddenly gave way beneath her foot. The broken rung threw her off balance. She lost her grip and fell toward the bottom of the tank. Instead of landing on dry steel, she dropped into several feet of standing water mixed with heavy sludge that had been left behind after the tank was drained. The fall left her seriously injured and unable to climb back to the ladder. Thick sediment held one of her legs in place each time she tried to pull herself free. The loud crash echoed through the empty tank. Noah immediately ran to the opening and looked inside. He saw Cressida trying to move, but realized the warning signs around the tank were there for a reason. Entering a confined space without proper equipment can quickly place another person in danger. Rather than climbing in himself, he called emergency services and stayed at the opening, trying to keep track of her while help was on the way. I don't think many people realize that the hardest choice can be refusing to jump in after someone you care about when doing so could make the situation even worse. Specially trained rescue crews arrived with equipment designed for confined space emergencies. Before anyone could enter, they had to secure the opening, test the atmosphere inside the tank, where their confined space checks detected unsafe air, and set up a safe lifting system. Those steps took valuable time, but skipping them could have created even more victims. By the time rescuers safely reached the bottom of the tank, Cressida had drowned. Although the unsafe air reinforced why the rescue had to follow strict confined space procedures, investigators determined that the injuries from her fall left her trapped in the standing water and sludge long before the atmosphere itself became the primary danger. The medical examiner later determined that injuries from the fall had prevented her from escaping the remaining water and sludge on her own. Investigators found that decades of moisture had severely weakened the ladder, causing one rung to fail. Contractors confirmed the remaining water and sediment had been intentionally left for later removal, and all warning signs and confined space barriers were already in place. After the incident, every remaining access hatch was welded shut until demolition was complete. The part that stays with me is how ordinary the tank looked from above. One decision to ignore a warning sign was all it took to turn an empty-looking space into a place no one could escape alone. At a private outdoor reptile enclosure in Ocala, Florida. The fenced area was used for handling and filming snakes. A small group of reptile enthusiasts had gathered there that day to watch a venom extraction demonstration being recorded for social media. The person leading the demonstration was Fiona Swinney, a 29-year-old reptile enthusiast and online content creator. Fiona had built a following by posting videos of herself handling dangerous animals. Many viewers enjoyed seeing close-up footage that most people would never attempt to capture themselves. Over time, however, her videos became increasingly extreme. What began as educational demonstrations gradually shifted toward more dramatic content designed to attract attention online. In the weeks leading up to the filming session, several of Fiona's recent videos had received fewer views than expected. According to friends, she had become increasingly focused on producing footage that would stand out from other reptile videos on social media. That day, Fiona planned to film a venom extraction involving a highly venomous snake. A friend operated the camera while several reptile enthusiasts watched nearby. The others remained outside the immediate handling area while Fiona performed the demonstration herself. The enclosure contained handling equipment that could have created additional distance between Fiona and the snake. Hooks, restraints, and other tools were available and commonly used during venom extractions. Fiona chose not to use them because she believed they would block the close-up shots she wanted and make the video less impressive. Most of the people present had seen Fiona work with venomous snakes before and assumed she understood the risks better than they did. As filming began, Fiona held the snake while explaining the extraction process. The animal repeatedly twisted, pulled away, and attempted to free itself. Each time, Fiona adjusted her grip and continued. As the session went on, the snake became increasingly difficult to manage. Several observers later stated that the animal appeared more agitated than it had at the beginning of the demonstration. At one point, a spectator suggested taking a moment to regain control before continuing, but Fiona declined and kept filming. I can see why Fiona thought she could get away with it. She had done this before, and every successful video probably made the next risk feel a little less dangerous. Minutes later, another observer suggested using one of the nearby handling tools to make the process safer. Once again, Fiona declined. She appeared confident that she could finish the demonstration the same way she had in previous videos. By that point, Fiona had already captured most of the footage she came to record, and the extraction demonstration was essentially complete. Instead of ending the session, she continued filming in hopes of getting a few additional shots for social media. Witnesses later stated that she repositioned the snake several times to create more dramatic camera angles, while the animal continued struggling to break free. According to those present, Fiona eventually lifted the snake beside her face and shoulder so the camera could capture a tighter image for a thumbnail and promotional clips. The snake was now only inches from her neck. Several people watching later admitted they felt uncomfortable with how close she had brought the animal to her face. Fiona continued anyway. As she adjusted her grip for the camera, she briefly lost control of the snake's head. The opening lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The snake struck. Its fangs sank into the side of Fiona's neck before anyone could react. The bite occurred directly in front of the camera lens. The snake immediately recoiled as Fiona released it and stumbled backward. Filming stopped as the people around her rushed to help and called emergency services. And just like that, the video she was trying so hard to perfect became the last thing anyone cared about. Responders arrived quickly and transported Fiona for advanced medical treatment. Because the bite had occurred in her neck, the venom entered her body rapidly and created a severe medical emergency. Despite treatment efforts, doctors were unable to reverse the damage caused by the venom. Fiona died later from the complications of the bite. The death was ruled accidental. Investigators concluded that Fiona continued handling the venomous snake despite warning signs, rejected safer methods, and brought the animal near her face for additional footage after the demonstration was essentially complete. It was August 18, 2021. A gray afternoon hung over the coastal mudflats near Olympic National Park in Washington. The tide was far out, exposing wide stretches of wet sand and mud. Small groups of visitors walked the shoreline, while seabirds moved across the flat. The weather seemed calm and ordinary. Out beyond that safe shoreline, 32-year-old John James Keller was walking around. Now, from what I gathered about James, he had spent pretty much his entire adult life trying to stay one step ahead of his younger brother, Roran. James was a fiercely competitive sales manager, and personally, I'd just call him stubborn. Roran, a videographer, had that same competitive streak. Their family gatherings usually turned into these harmless little contests that neither brother ever wanted to lose. Well, that afternoon, the brothers were exploring a remote tidal area notorious for dangerous mudflats. Warning signs were posted everywhere explaining that the deep mud could trap you and that the incoming tides had actually killed people, but the brothers just blew off the warning. And this is where things took a turn that personally makes my stomach drop. Their little debate turned into a dare. Both of them stepped right past the warning signs and started walking across the mudflats, filming it on their phones. At first, the ground felt totally solid. They were laughing and pushing farther out. About 15 minutes later, James dropped knee-deep into the muck. Roran just laughed and started recording. James tried to yank his leg free, but as I'm sure you can picture, that only drove his other leg even deeper. Within minutes, the mud swallowed him past his thighs. Bystanders begged them to call 911. Personally, it looks like neither brother wanted wanted to swallow their pride and admit this was a real emergency. For nearly an hour, Roran tried everything, yanking James's arms and digging with his bare hands, but honestly, it was completely useless. The mud created a terrifying suction, holding tighter the more they struggled. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking, and I can only imagine the panic setting in as the tide was slowly creeping back. A tourist finally called for help. Responders were sent immediately, but reaching them took forever because James was trapped several hundred yards from solid ground. And thinking about how much time was wasted before that call was finally made is ridiculous. By the time rescue crews arrived, shallow water was already pooling around James. Rescuers carefully deployed specialized mud rescue equipment, including inflatable paths and safety lines to avoid becoming trapped themselves. Once they reached him, rescuers secured harnesses around his upper body and attempted to free his legs using water jets and rescue tools designed to break the suction around buried limbs. But the mud extended far deeper than anyone initially realized. Every attempt to free him took precious time, and the incoming tide kept rising. I've heard about the body camera footage from that night, and honestly, it sounds like a living nightmare. It shows rescuers working continuously for more than an hour while the water rises from around James's knees to his waist and eventually to his chest. The situation fell apart fast. The incoming seawater made it impossible to keep digging, and James was freezing and exhausted. Soon, the rescuers faced a terrifying reality. They were about to get trapped and drown themselves. Supervisors had to make the brutal call and order the crew to retreat. James stayed stuck as the ocean completely covered him. Recovery teams found James's body later that night. What stands out in the investigation is the timeline. Nearly an hour passed between the moment he became trapped and the moment anyone called for help. Investigators concluded that an earlier emergency call would likely have given rescuers enough time to reach him before conditions became fatal. The death was ruled accidental. Following the incident, park officials renewed warnings about reporting emergencies immediately, even when people believe they can solve the problem themselves. The case was later referenced in visitor safety materials as an example of how delaying a rescue request can quickly turn a survivable situation into a fatal one. It's devastating to think about. A delay driven largely by pride and embarrassment ended up costing James his life. It was February 14th, 2018, in Minneapolis. Temperatures had stayed below zero for 3 straight days. Ice had frozen many sliding balcony doors shut, turning an everyday inconvenience into a problem that, for one woman in a hurry, would have devastating consequences. Sarah Collins was 32 and worked as a supply chain analyst. She was the kind of person who planned everything, right down to color-coded calendars and backup schedules. Friends teased her that she treated even small errands like they were business projects, but that's just how she was. That Saturday morning, she had volunteered to coach a youth soccer clinic for the first time. She wanted to make a good impression, and with only an hour before she needed to leave, she remembered her boots and cleats were still packed away in a storage box on her apartment balcony. The problem was that the sliding glass door was completely frozen shut. It wouldn't budge. She spent 30 minutes trying to scrape it with a butter knife, just getting more and more stressed because she couldn't afford to waste any time. It's one of those moments where you're so focused on the goal that you just lose sight of the bigger picture. She finally remembered she had a small butane torch in her kitchen, the kind for creme brulee. In her panicked state, she probably thought it was a smart, quick way to melt the ice on the track. She got down on her knees and started running that flame along the aluminum frame. It actually seemed to be working, and she could see the ice melting. But here's the thing. The glass was freezing cold on the outside because of the sub-zero weather, and she was heating it up fast on the inside. That huge temperature difference, it was a total recipe for disaster. Without any warning, the glass just shattered. It didn't just crack, it exploded both ways. It burst into thousands of small, tempered glass pieces that blasted outward with surprising force. Sarah was kneeling only inches away when it happened. The edge of the collapsing panel struck her, while dozens of fast-moving glass fragments hit her face and neck. One of those fragments opened a deep wound along the side of her neck. She was bleeding heavily, but she managed to get up and stagger toward the kitchen counter where her phone was charging. With blood covering her hands, she managed to unlock it and tap the emergency call button before collapsing beside the cabinets. The call connected, but she was too weak to speak. The dispatcher kept asking if anyone was there, but all they could hear was faint movement before the line went quiet. Even without an answer, they sent help right away. When firefighters forced the door open a few minutes later, they found Sarah on the kitchen floor just a few feet from her phone. They rushed to treat her, but she had already lost too much blood. The autopsy ruled her death a tragic accident. Investigators determined the glass had been heated too quickly, causing it to shatter from thermal shock. Although tempered glass is designed to break into small pieces instead of large shards, the force of the panel bursting apart sent fragments flying across the kitchen. Several caused deep cuts, including one that severed her carotid artery. The soccer clinic went ahead that morning, but Sarah never arrived. As friends and volunteers tried calling her, parents assumed she had been delayed by the weather. It wasn't until later that afternoon that they learned what had happened. Investigators later reminded the public never to use an open flame to thaw frozen glass or door frames, as rapid heating can cause tempered glass to fail without warning. In the years that followed, the Youth League dedicated its first clinic of each season to Sarah's memory, a reminder that a few minutes saved are never worth risking a dangerous shortcut. And that's the part that stays with you the most. She was so close to walking out that door, and she never got the chance. It was September 1st, 2012, in Zion National Park, Utah. Hikers moved through the visitor area collecting maps and water, while park staff monitored forecasts for thunderstorms expected later that day. Among those hikers was 38-year-old Sebastian Avery. 38-year-old Sebastian Avery was a tech sales manager known for finding the absolute fastest route to everything, whether it was a work project or a hiking trail. Personally, I think we all know someone just like that. He and his wife Emily were on vacation in Zion National Park. Emily usually planned their trips and checked the weather, but Sebastian relied almost entirely on technology. He trusted navigation apps with his life. Honestly, it's a habit a lot of us are guilty of. That morning, a park ranger told them a popular slot canyon route was closed due to expected thunderstorms. But to me, it's so frustrating to see what Sebastian did next. He checked his phone, saw the app still listed the route as open, and assumed the ranger's info was just outdated. They kept hiking and passed a physical closure sign. Sebastian stepped right around it. Farther down the trail, they hit another warning sign about flash floods. If I were Emily, I would have been losing my mind here, and she did beg him to turn back. But Sebastian pointed to his screen, arguing that thousands of people trust this app every day. By afternoon, the canyon walls narrowed and thunder echoed nearby. Because the sky directly overhead was still clear, Sebastian assumed the warnings were exaggerated. In my opinion, he just used this to validate his own bias. They pushed deeper inside. Shortly after 3 o'clock, a thin stream on the canyon floor instantly turned into a rushing torrent of thick, muddy water, rocks, and debris. They managed to scramble onto a narrow ledge a few feet up. I can only imagine how terrifying it must have been, just trapped there while the flood roared right below them. They stayed on the ledge for nearly 2 hours while floodwater rushed through the canyon. Eventually, the current slowed, and much of the canyon floor became visible again. Emily wanted to wait for help, but Sebastian believed the danger had passed. After climbing down, they carefully continued through the canyon. Minutes later, Sebastian slipped on mud-covered sandstone, falling hard and breaking his leg while suffering a head injury. It is very disturbing to think he was completely immobilized. Emily tried calling 911 but had no signal. As daylight faded, she moved between Sebastian and a higher rock shelf, searching for a way out, but he couldn't climb. Hours later, a second flood surge roared into the canyon. Emily scrambled back onto the elevated shelf, but Sebastian could barely move. Because of his injuries, he was overtaken by the water. Emily survived the night and was rescued the next morning. Rescuers found Sebastian's body downstream. The medical examiner confirmed he drowned after being trapped by the second flood. When I look at the park's investigation, the facts are incredibly clear. The canyon was closed the day before, warnings were posted everywhere, and rangers were on high alert. What really stays with me is what the investigators stated at the end. If they had just stayed on that ledge and waited, both would have lived.